I've got to briefly talk about your chart forays on Top of the Pops in 1987 with a certain song that suddenly. What was that like being on Top of the Pops?
It was fabulous.
Surreal?
Yes, it was in a sense. The great story about the day is that we went there the day earlier and did a sort of a walkthrough with lighting and shit, and then it was a bit like Countdown. They sort of, you kind of rehearse a couple of times and then you do it. So anyway, Cliff Richards was on. And I'd met Cliff while I was doing Midday, and we hit it off. And I got invited to functions that he attended, prayer meetings. Some of them, a couple of them were actually in private homes, and there was like about 15 or 20 people there, and it would be a prayer. They were called prayer meetings. I mean, they did talk about being born again, and they talked about, and there was an opening prayer, which wasn't, not very long, just a prayer of welcome. But towards the end, he would talk about his Christianity, and he would then lead the group in prayer. And so usually with the person's house that it was in. And when we're talking about, very wealthy people, with very, very, very wealthy connections. So I got to know Cliff and his manager, John, I think his name was, and he was bald too, which is another thing we had in common, because there wasn't a whole lot of baldies around in those days. So that was during the 80s, like when they were doing Midday, because Ray loved Cliff. And, we'd go to the tennis and stuff, because he was a real tennis nut. But, so we end up all these years later doing Top of the Pops. So he arrives, right, to do his rehearsal run. And I'm in the room next door to him, and it was a room about the size of a broom closet, as they say. Come in my room. So I go into his room. So we're talking about this, and he said, mate, this is this song that he just released. He said, this is my 50th or something, some ridiculous amount. If it goes number one, it'll be my 50th number one. And he said, but if yours goes number one, because it was number 3 at the time, he said, because he said Kylie and Jason, the characters, Kylie and Craig. It was Craig, wasn't it? Wasn't Craig her partner in the wedding?
No, Jason Donovan. So it was
Jason Donovan.
Kylie Minogue and Jason.
Yeah, I get them mixed up.
Easy to do.
Cutesy blonde guys. So he said, have you heard the song? I said, no. He said, it's fucking awful. And he said,
those words?
Pretty much, yeah. Being Christian doesn't mean you can't swear. But having said that, he said, so, if it's, if I've got to miss out, and I don't know, but I was about to say by the grace of God, the fact that it was Cliff and it was England, I think it was kind of like this. They willed it to be number one, and this duet that Kylie and Jason had, and it wasn't a great song. The funny thing about it was we were both with the same record label, and yeah, so he ended up going into number one slot. They were number two, and I was number three.
Yeah.
But on sales, which the guy from the record company, 3 days prior to that, based on sales, and they were counting the sales by hours. That's how intensive it was. And to be number one at Christmas time, be number two, number three was extraordinary. Plus, an Australian who's the singer for a band called Rose Tattoo, nah, this doesn't happen. But yeah, we were 1, 2, and 3.
Did the record label, after the successes, suddenly try to push you down that power ballad route and do more? We want more.
Yes and no. They repackaged me in a sense because it was Scott Waterman and Aikman or whatever, but it was their record label. And so there's a terrific cover which they did for the album, and I'm sort of resting on my hands, on my arms, and looking very soulful, with a leather jacket on. So there's no ink showing or anything like that. And the second single, which they pulled off, was "Calling," which is the song about the language of Wales. And I'd explained to them what it was about, and they just loved it. They just thought it was fantastic. They did this beautiful cover for the single with a depiction, a painting, if you like, or in other words, someone drew it of a whale. And they loved the whole story behind it. And there was a huge backlash there. Oh, fucking angry Anderson, fucking turned his back on his roots and fucking, blah, blah, blah. And even in Australia, there was a certain amount of like, well, it was almost like, aren't I, as an artist, aren't I allowed to do other things? Aren't I allowed to express myself in a different way? Because that album, even though it was mistakenly released as Rose Tattoo, it was the first of 3 albums that I signed with Mushroom to do as Angry.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that because originally it was solo, and then it Beats from a Single Drum is the album, became a Rose Tattoo. So that was a record label. We've got to put you as Rose Tattoo.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, they were having difficulty selling the idea to radio because the first single off the album was "Calling," and we did a rather extensive shoot for "Calling." I went and swam with a miniature whale at SeaWorld. The stuff that was done at sea, because I always had this thing about sail and being a pirate and all that kind of shit. And actually, someone who became a great friend of mine during shooting Thunderdome was Dean Semler, who was the director of cinema photography. And he shot that clip, organised a friend of his that owned that ketch, and we went out for a day sailing, like all day, and then they shot some stuff at sunset, which was rather lovely. But yeah, the people, the PR people at Mushroom just had, I don't know if they panicked or it was just marketing money or whatever, but the explanation I got was that they were just having a lot of trouble selling me as a solo artist. But "Calling? What's it about?" "Well, it's about the language of Wales." What the fuck? There's another track on there called "Winnie Mandela," which I thought was a single. It's got a big, strong chorus, and it's got harmony, chorus, and yeah, they just didn't get it.
It's a really good album, and it was made. It could have done really well in America. It's got that sort of American rock sound, you know, the
Well,
American orientated rock sound.
It was produced by an American,
Yeah,
and it was produced with an eye and an ear towards, particularly an eye to the American market. And they said, look, I remember the producer saying we should release it. You know, he thought, which I thought quite rightfully so, we needed to go back into the studio, like particularly Andy and I, and we had a few more ideas for songs, write a few more songs, but there was a sort of like an impatient sort of vibe we got that, no, we want this fucking thing out, you know, like we spent too much money on it, blah blah blah. Let's just throw these tracks together and bang it out, right? Because you can tell that on that album that there's three or four tracks that are so well produced. Suddenly being one of the other one. The other one is the song that I picked for the wedding, which is Falling, which is the other love song. And Andy Shishon and I, who was the bass player, who's also a classically trained pianist, he and I wrote most of those songs, or you know, the best part of them. But yeah, there was some wonderful talent involved in that. Timmy Gay's playing guitar, and actually Stuart Fraser played guitar on one of those tracks.